Good evening, everybody. City Council, those in the audience, thanks for coming. I call the special meeting of the Ames City Council for Tuesday, November 15th to order. And this is a workshop which is dedicated to discussion on climate action plan staff report. So I'll turn it over to Deb.
All right. Well, good evening, Mayor and Council, and thank you for this opportunity to bring us all back together and be re-engaged on the climate action planning process that the city has been engaged with. I do want to start by some introductions because we have our climate action project team as well as the SSG team. And so I'll kick that off with Deb Shildroth, Assistant City Manager, and I'm part of the project team.
Hi, Suzanne Guiazza, Public Information Officer with the City of Ames.
And then we have in the row behind us, Don Com on the project team, as well as Mary Rankin. And I'll turn it over to SSG to introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. My name is Naomi Devine. I'm a climate action planner and member owner of SSG for Sustainability Solutions Group. I've also been the the engagement lead on this project. And now Eric and I co-lead the project. So Eric Frenette, over to you.
Thank you, Naomi. Eric Frenette. I'm co-leading the project and lead modeler for the project.
All right, thank you. And at some point during the meeting, we'll have Yul Herbert join us. He is also with SSG, and he is involved in another meeting right now, but will be joining us shortly. And then I also want to acknowledge we have several city staff here in council chambers with us this evening. They were instrumental, very instrumental in helping us pull together the information in the report that is before you tonight. So I don't want to overlook them and the time they spent on this. And they are available for questions once we get to the staff report. So at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to SSG, and they will kick it off with a recap of the climate action target and the big moves and action steps.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be back and to see everybody as well. So, and we have some exciting and wonderful information to share with you by way of a project update tonight. So let's dive right in. Let's go to the next slide, please. So you might remember this diagram talking about on the way when we put together a climate action plan, and we've got a little bit of a change up to, like in any good climate action plan, of course, it's been adaptive and responsive to the needs of the particular partners that we're working with, so with the city of Ames. And so we're where the green sort of dashed line is, if you will. And so what has happened, and we're going to get into more detail tonight, is SSG did its high-level modeling results and not quite yet a detailed implementation strategy. You'll see that that's, of course, next. What's going to be great about informing that detailed implementation strategy is the work that staff have also carried out over the past, I think, about 7 months. But Deb, please correct me if I'm wrong about that exact timeline there. A lot of good work has been done, and there's a current sort of staff report that we'll also be focusing on this evening that sort of takes those the high-level modeling that we did and sort of does some ground truthing as one sort of pathway to implementation. The staff review, like I said, will inform the implementation plan that SSG is putting together, and we'll dive more into the details into that shortly. In the meantime, just as a quick reminder, though, as well, in March, the Supplemental Input Committee sort of heard the results from the 6 Big Moves Community Survey. There was about 626 responses that were received through a combination of online and paper sources. So that's helped sort of inform this process, as well as has the other meetings of the Supplemental Input Committee. And this survey data itself generated about data about attitudes, preferences, and educational opportunities. Engagement and community support is really important to this process, of course, to us and to the city of Ames. So there's also been about 15 speaking engagements throughout the year as well, reaching out to the community to keep them informed of what's happening with the plan and sort of doing that outreach work that's necessary for any sort of process like this. And so what we'll be doing going forward is we're going to be taking a look, of course, at we've taken a look at the results of the report itself. We're going to be working with the project team, and we'll be talking about more specific engagement opportunities related to the implementation plan, and so the last sort of portion of the climate action planning and implementation planning process. Let's go to the next slide. The big sort of takeaway, though, that's really important here, and you probably were not expecting a slide like this earlier today, we saw it was on the agenda, is we've sort of frozen in time exactly where we are in this climate action planning to implementation planning process. And so what sort of sets any good climate action planning and implementation planning process is real sort of is sort of a daring endeavor, sort of, if you will. And so, it begins in the climate action planning part, which is the what and the why, we're doing. And, what speed at which do you want to do this? And so those are the target-based discussions that we had at the beginning of this, the beginning stages of this process in the first few months. And we did a survey on that, sort of as well. And we get to the modeling. For the modeled actions, there's modeled and non-modeled actions that essentially comprise a good climate action plan and implementation planning process. So we model, of course, what we can, because we're talking about, of course, a low carbon pathway, which is, of course, set by that target as well. So that gives us the what and the why. Implementation is its own type of journey, and the second part of this. And that's the how. How do we go about making this what and why a reality? And there's multiple pathways to getting there. So Eric's going to review what we had in store, essentially that's going to help guide that. And of course, we're going to blend that with the staff report results that we'll be discussing this evening. But essentially what you see on the slide here is a lot of what can make up what that implementation sort of pathway looks like and how long, or short it will be. So in terms of like what current funding sources essentially are available, there's a variety of potential sources for that. There's the non-modeled actions that we need to consider as well. Things like geopolitical context or new things that have come up like the IRA, and Eric's going to talk about the funding opportunities presented there, and of course partnerships as well with different levels of government. And so with that, and I realize I've got my speedy, sort of voice on, so I'll try and slow down for my remaining portions of the evening. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Eric to take the presentation forward.
Thank you, Naomi. So to start, since it's been a bit of time since last time we've met and looked at results and what came out of the model, we'll start by reviewing that and the project to date. So to start, if we look back at the target we set, it's a pretty ambitious target. We set this in line with a 1.5 degree fair share pathway. And what that means, we have two targets that we're modeling towards in the model. The first one is 83% reduction by 2030. And after that, net zero by 2050. So that's the target for this project, and Ames is not alone in this endeavor. Many cities, many municipalities have undertaken similar targets, some more ambitious, some less ambitious. Ames's target is in the more ambitious of the targets that are currently out there in the US. There's over 100 American cities that have made a pledge to get to net zero emissions. And if we look at a few examples, there's a lot, but if we look at just a few here, there's Des Moines, which is very close by, that has an ambitious carbon-free target by 2035. Arlington County in Virginia that has 100% clean renewable electricity by 2035, and Kansas City net zero by 2050, but the list goes on and on and on. So takeaway here is that this is a movement that's happening. It's happening right now. Many communities are going through this, are going through the planning stage or have completed the planning and are in the implementation phase of their projects. Now, if you look at the results, here you might notice on the left that we are not meeting that target in the model in 2030. So it's a very ambitious target, and we've pushed, and we showed this last time too, we've pushed the actions in the model very far, very quickly, very strongly, and we get to about 70% reduction by 2030. The main reason for this, I guess the main reason is the speed at which to change entire systems necessary puts a lot of stress on the system. It's hard to get there that fast. And one of the main sectors that's hard to change that quickly is the transportation sector, because you have this very massive existing stock of vehicles using gasoline and diesel that are not at the end of life yet, and you have to turn that over very, very quickly to be able to achieve this target. So we get to 70% reduction by 2030 in the model and 94% reduction by 2050. And what's remaining in 2050 is grid electricity. So we're still importing electricity in the model but by the end of the time frame, and that electricity is not completely clean. And we still have some waste emissions in the system as well. Now, how we get to those levels of reduction is divided into 30 or so different actions. We won't go through each one here, but it's dozens of different actions for different sectors that achieve different reduction rates at different speeds. And when you combine all of those together, you get the trajectory that we're seeing in the model. So 70% reduction by 2030 and close to 100% reduction by 2050. This is another model output that's very detailed, just to say what we produce and what we've given staff for their analysis. So we have an action by action, and I won't go through each one here, but we have the action by action financials. How much did that action cost in the model? What type of reductions did it generate? And the cost of investment, the savings, energy savings, operations and maintenance savings, and the picture for each one in this way. So we get to the bottom line, net present value of nearly $900 million, which we showed last time, and that's the, we have a capital cost of around $2.4 billion and then savings of $1.5 billion when you get to the end of that time span. So the capital cost is a lot of upfront costs and investments things like high capital costs for retrofits or vehicles or things like that. And the savings are generally energy savings. So if you invest in more efficient buildings, you'll use less energy over time and get savings in that way. If you invest in electric vehicles, you'll get less operating and maintenance costs down the line and have savings in that way. So we showed kind of after 2050, once you get to the end of the analysis, what that means, the bottom line, but each and every year is modeled, and each and every year has its investments and its savings. And the key thing here is that you'll see a lot of blue towards the left and then increasing red and yellow towards the right. So a lot of investments and capital expenditures early on and savings later on. And a lot of the puzzle of trying to get to these types of reductions is how to get the financing or funding for that front part of the plan. So very investment heavy, and then down the line, increasing savings. And one way to see this too, if we flatten that out by using 3%, so basically looking at financing, in this case, where you get financing for the different investments, you'll see that you can smooth out the capital expenditures over time and kind of level it out with the savings you get. So financing is very much an important part of the plan and a way to get to these actions. So the big takeaways before we jump to the next section is that these costs, this $900 million and the 2.4 investment and the savings, this is a community plan. That's for the whole community. And it's not, there's no Ames, the city organization of Ames, there's no expectation for the city to fund each and every one of these actions, each and every part of these actions. It's very much a community effort. The primary role for Ames, the city organization, is to support, educate, and create incentives. So some funding, some financing, some loans, some grants, things like that, that will provide the necessary incentive to have the momentum to accomplish these actions. A lot of these actions have benefits on their own, as we'll see, especially things like investments in electric vehicles that might need less pushing, and some of them have higher costs, such as retrofits that might need more of a push to get to the levels that we're seeing here. And another key takeaway is that for now, where we are in the process, and we talked about this, but I think it's important to remind ourselves about this, that we've done the model run, we have the model outputs, so we have the what, we have, this is physically what would need to happen to decarbonize to these amounts. And the next step for us is to create an implementation strategy. So we take the what needs to happen physically and look at what are the mechanisms here, what are the right mechanisms for this, what are the funding opportunities that exist, what kind of programs do we want to design around this, and we haven't done that yet. That's the next step for us. And finally, to succeed in this type of plan, Ames needs to be adaptable and opportunistic to succeed. And I'll expand on that here.
And Eric, if I can jump in for one quick second too, just on that last point that you made there, that last takeaway. Having a climate action plan completed or adopted in terms of completing the plan itself and starting on implementation is often also what allows you to be most adaptable and opportunistic, because it's often a precursor to funding from other partners or levels of government, sort of as well. They want to see that this work has been done first.
Yeah, that's right. So we'll look at some examples of why it's important to be flexible, adaptable, and opportunistic. And we've highlighted two things here. You'll see there's the recently passed Inflation Reduction Act, which has massive amounts of funding for businesses, individuals, municipalities, state level governments across the board for a bunch of different sectors, and also the changing geopolitical context. So this could be a great deal of things. We'll just touch on the war in Ukraine and the impact that has had on natural gas prices, because the price of natural gas is set as a world price. So in the US, you're affected by things that happen elsewhere that could affect that price. So if we look at those, first of all, the Inflation Reduction Act. So this was officially passed in August, and it's the single largest investment in climate and energy in American history. It's very massive. There's around $400 billion of funding that's available, and it will be very key to take advantage of this and be opportunistic about the different programs that they offer. So we'll look at different funding opportunities when we go through the different actions in the next section. But one key thing for Ames's plan is renewable energy. And Ames is in a unique position that it owns its own utility. It has more opportunity and power there to make the big changes that are needed. And one part of or many parts of the Inflation Reduction Act will help with that and offer funding for renewable energy, either through producing your own energy or investing in energy. And right now, there's been different modeling efforts that have been done on the impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act, and some of the results are showing that electricity rates are expected to decline 5 to 6.7% over the next decade due to this funding, saving consumers around $200 billion. The average household is expected to save around $200 annually. And I think the main point here, the third point here, is that we've been very conservative in the model and in the financials, as we've modeled a increasing rate year over year up to 45% increase in electricity rates for power purchasing agreements for renewable energy. So in our model, we've had massive amounts of renewable energy coming in at a cost, and that cost we've estimated at around 45% increase. What we're seeing now with the IRA and new information coming out is that through that funding, rates should actually be expected to decrease. So that's just one way in how things can change quickly, even since the last time we've met, in different opportunities and how you need to adapt to those opportunities. And especially, and here, if we look at the geopolitics lens of it, here you see on the right the increase in natural gas that's projected for this winter, and just that big jump since we started this project, where we're down here, there's a 75% increase for the US Midwest that's forecasted and that's happening. So that jump in natural gas changes every action that's touching on electrification, where you're switching away from natural gas and going towards electrification, and affects many different parts of the plan. And that $900 million that we've shown at the beginning, it's expensive, and different plans have, and different analyses have different results. Some communities actually for plans like this show a net positive at the end for savings. Some show a net cost at the end. We had a $900 million cost. A lot of that is dependent on energy prices. In Ames, natural gas prices are relatively cheap compared to electricity, so when you're switching, there's a high cost to that. Now, if we look at, just as a sensitivity analysis, look at the effect of the IRA on electricity rates and assume that instead of increasing 45% in the future, let's just look at the case where they stay constant, you'd see that costs go down from $900 million to $125 million. So highly sensitive to energy prices. And then if we look at the increase in natural gas prices and keep those in mind with what we're now seeing and the increased trajectory of those prices that we're seeing now, and combine those two, you'll see in the bottom here, the B+C scenarios, we're actually looking at $300 million in savings. So we didn't change the actions here. We didn't change anything about the plan. The context changed. And that context change completely or significantly alters the financial picture. So it's very important to be aware of this and be adaptable and opportunistic. Now we'll take a look at the different actions we've modeled and look at different examples of communities, other communities that are undertaking similar actions.
Before we move on, is this a good place to ask questions?
Yeah, sure.
So I don't want to like switch topics. So could you clarify, when we met before, we were looking at 2.3 to 3 billion but that was before all of the inflation. And we've been dealing locally with very extreme inflation in our construction. Does that change given the fact that the investment is heavily capital and infrastructure intensive? Does that change the projection? Should we be looking at a different number than 2.4 billion?
Yeah, that's a good point. So similarly to how we looked at these different situations here that could arise, I think the inflation case is another one. Is it short term? Is it long term? What does that look like, and how does it affect the plan? It will affect things like retrofits. It will affect things like new buildings. And as part of the implementation strategy, we will address that and show what that impact is and what the risk is there.
I apologize. Maybe the answer was there and I didn't hear it. So for our purposes, because these investments are not made in the near future, you're presuming that inflation will come down and you're comfortable staying with the 2.4 billion?
So what we're showing, the results that we're showing do not include the past year's increase in inflation. But we will, so that's important. We're not assuming that they'll go down right away, but they could go, there's different possibilities. They could go down, or they could keep increasing, or they could stay the same. And I think that piece, those risks are important pieces to address in the implementation strategy that's forthcoming, that we haven't done yet.
And just to add to that, yeah, this is a snapshot of the financials of the information that was, of course, available at that point in time. So what Eric's saying is we continue to take a look at the variety of pathways that now exist from this point in time going forward. So you'll see that kind of analysis in the implementation plan.
I'm going to let this go. I respectfully, I'm not sure my question still was answered. This is a big deal for us. We can't build a road. We can't do anything here without having to deal with the 8.4% inflation. So you may not want to deal with this at this point, but we're going to have to think about this at some point as far as how viable that number is. Let's go ahead and go on, though.
Okay, so if for the next section, we'll look at the different actions we've modeled. We had that list of 30 or so different actions. We've grouped those into the big six, the 6 categories here, grouping all those different actions. And we will go through each one to look at the results of what was modeled for each. So the first one is for building retrofits. What we've assumed in the model for building retrofits is that 90% of buildings retrofit by 2035, all municipal buildings retrofit by 2030, air source heat pumps for all buildings by 2040, and replacing hot water heating systems with electric by 2040. This results in cumulative emissions reduction of nearly 3,000 kilotons and about 15% of our emissions reduction across all our big categories. And the net cost is $927 million. So this is definitely one of the highest cost actions, very much upfront capital costs of investment, and then long-term energy savings from that reduced energy use. Now, if we look at an example of community that's taking action on retrofits, there's this case of Ithaca, New York, which is a city of about 30,000 people, and their way of tackling this is they've partnered with a private company called Block Power, which specializes in retrofit and electrification of buildings, and their business model is basically to help with that high upfront cost, that high capital cost that many people can't afford, and provide financing. And how they make money is basically once you make that initial investment and then unlock those savings long term, they share those savings with the person that's in that building or the owner of the building, and so on. So it's a clever way of getting to the financing problem behind a lot of these actions. Their goal is 6,000 building retrofits by 2030. And their financial model is basically low cost loans and getting rid of that high upfront payment and then to share the energy savings.
And so what's also important to underscore about the example is that it also is driven by that goal, having that in the first place, designed to figure out how are they actually going to make this happen, both from the physical sort of aspect to the financial aspect of it, and then the reality of the money, who pays what and who gets what savings at the end of the day.
I think
So,
just a question. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So under this model, who is the borrower, the city or the property owners?
The city and with the property owners, it's very much young company that's already has a proven track record, especially in New York City and now in Ithaca, New York, and a few other municipalities. And it would be a partnership with the city and with the residents to get this going.
And do you have a sense of the amount of investment? And again, this is because we're dealing with cities of different size. Ithaca is 31,000. We're say 68,000, give or take. How does the per capita investment compare?
So they've worked with Ithaca here, that's 30,000, but they've also worked in New York City, which is just way more. So there's no change in the way their business model works. Basically, they're providing, I guess I'll get a bit into the technical side of it, but they have proprietary software and algorithms to analyze where the biggest savings for energy retrofits are. They can target specific neighborhoods, the very equity-minded too. They can target more lower-income neighborhoods and start that way and look at where the biggest savings are. And they finance the projects and then share out the savings from the project. So they make money when the building owners and residents make money down the line.
Yeah, I understood that before, but that's, again, I apologize not answering my question. And I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm just trying to understand when you take those upfront costs and you divide them out by the number of people, that would be a per capita cost. And so I'm just trying to understand, how do we think about the per capita costs? And obviously New York is going to have a larger population base. You can spread those fixed costs over more people. But we're not in New York, we're in Ames. And so I'm trying to understand what the per capita costs are for our citizens. And if you don't know the answer, that's okay. But do you have a sense of what those per capita costs would be under the building retrofits?
In terms of, sorry, just to clarify, do you mean in terms of upfront cost? Because in this particular example, there isn't an upfront cost. The risk is assumed by the company and the savings are then shared.
I apologize. I thought you said that the property owners and the city were the borrowers. Did I misunderstand that?
So let's see if I have a graph that can help with this. Basically, in the case for retrofits, not for all buildings, but for a lot of buildings, you'll have a lot of potential energy savings down the line. More energy savings than the upfront cost. And the hurdle that people are having is to get that upfront cost and invest in it. So what this company does is look at buildings that have those high potential of energy savings, and they finance it. There's no upfront cost to residents or business owners. They then share the energy savings down the line. So no upfront cost.
Well, I guess that solves things then.
Yeah, it's a pretty
It's amazing.
Innovative solution to the problem.
Very good. Thank you. You've answered my question.
So the city puts nothing in at all?
There might be, we'd have to, I'd be happy to try and help you set up maybe some meeting or with Block Power, but I'm not like an expert on their model. From my understanding, it would be first initial meetings with them to get a sense of what they could do. And there's other similar companies too. It doesn't have to be Block Power. And then maybe there is some cost to the city to set up the program. I'm not sure about that. I can't answer that.
So based on the council or the staff report, the estimate was about $60,000 per retrofit for buildings. So by doing the math, they're looking at investing $360 million in retrofits in the next 8 years. Is that correct?
I'm not sure what the arrangement would be with block power. It could be a pilot project. It could be starting out. They might want to ramp up more quickly. I think it could take many different forms.
Well, the reason I'm asking is that you're presenting that their goal is 6,000 building retrofits in the next 8 years. And I'm just trying to get my mind wrapped around that's $360 million of financing that someone's got to come up with. And they're not going to do that for free or out of, through an altruistic, purpose. And so there's going to be an ROI they're going to have to figure in on there. And there's going to be a risk factor figured in too. So I'm just trying to understand these numbers. You just can't get your mind wrapped around them in terms of the amount of money. And to have someone that has that kind of ability to borrow that significant amount of money and find workforce to do the work.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to understand. I mean, we can present an image or a plan, which is great. It sounds wonderful. But as we've talked about all along here, we're interested in the details and how's this going to, unfold to make sure that we're not saying, well, we're just going to follow Ithaca, New York and find out, well, it was a goal, but we couldn't accomplish it. See what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think what I'd like to do is point one thing out, just pull back up for a second. We're not in the full implementation sort of plan presentation tonight, so we wanted to give some examples of how other cities have handled similar issues, because it's a similar building decarbonization, building retrofit decarbonization is something that all municipalities and cities across the United States and Canada have to face in terms of if they want to decarbonize for the future. In this particular case, being a public-private partnership, much of the risk of course, which is negotiated between Ithaca and Block Power, is taken on by the private corporation. So in this case, they raised the equivalent of $55 million. And they had another company commit 50 million sort of to it. So they're taking on a lot of that financial risk because they've done the net present value analysis and the future savings analysis that Eric was talking about to show that they're going to save X amount per building. And they start with the highest target, for energy savings, potential buildings. So they're the ones that sort of go in and kind of understand where those greatest savings essentially could be. I don't want to get us to get too bogged down in the weeds of this, but if it's something that you want us to sort of investigate further as we write out the implementation plan, and it sounds to me perhaps by this discussion that it is, I wouldn't see why it wouldn't be. We're happy to sort of go into further detail in the future.
I just think the council and the public needs to have a realistic understanding of what is actually being implemented or done or proposed. So we don't have this overly optimistic view of what could be accomplished or someone else is doing. So I think your data helps. You're saying they got $110 million raised. Their goal doesn't say they're going to do it, but their goal is retrofits, and they're going to target the highest rate of return they can in terms of energy saving, which makes complete sense. So I think that helps explain a little bit what's going on. And I do agree that private-public partnership is interesting, but I'd be really curious to find out what their expected ROI, what they're charging for interest, a lot of things, especially with the Fed, raising interest rates every couple of months.
Definitely, and that's further information that we can gather as much as possible for you and bring that back in the implementation plan report.
Thank you.
And I think what I'd like to do is there's a lot more information to come. So I think what we'll do is we'll just try to get through that, and then we'll have some time for question and answer after as well.
Okay, that sounds good. So we looked at the example for building retrofits, and now this is a quick snapshot of all the different programs available in the Inflation Reduction Act for things like retrofits. And if we zoom into one of them, what does that mean for building owners and homeowners? Especially for low to moderate income households, there's up to $14,000 now in the IRA for efficiency and electrification. And you can see that broken down here. So all that to say that there are many new funding opportunities that will help fund this plan and take the next step on these actions. The next action is for net zero new construction. So in the model, we have that all buildings constructed in 2026 and after will be net zero ready. By 2030, there'll be a passive house standard. So net zero ready is a little bit less stringent than passive house. I won't get into the technical details, but that's the main idea. Passive house has an energy per square meter target. So that's what we're aiming for in the model. And then we have that all new municipally owned buildings to be net zero energy ready beginning in 2023 and passive house by 2025. This leads to 578 kilotons of cumulative emissions reductions, 3% of all our actions, and $180 million in net cost. Here's one example, and this is just one example that we thought was interesting to show, but this is in Brooklyn, obviously much higher population than in Ames. But what's interesting about this one is it's a project that's done. It's been built in 2020. It's been built to passive house standard, results in 70% lower energy costs. It's targeted to low income and formerly homeless families who are benefiting from those lower energy costs and improved air quality and also other aspects that are not included in the modeling outputs, but are important, such as resiliency to heat waves. And this came in at a cost of $100 million, and it's 275 units. So we're not saying that Ames should do this exact thing. Just one example of something that's already happened in the spirit of this action. There's also many funding opportunities available in the IRA for this. New energy efficient home tax credit and assistance for zero building energy code adoption, which is a bit tricky for Ames as the municipality does not have control. That's my understanding. It does not have control over the building codes. That's a state level thing, but this might incite, this could help the state of Iowa adopt more stringent building codes because there's a lot of funding here available and that would have a direct impact on Ames. The next action is renewable energy generation. We have massive amounts of renewable energy in the model. Rooftop solar, 220 megawatts, total 300 megawatts of ground mount utility scale solar by 2045. We also have wind, and we've also modeled home scale battery storage. This is the biggest reducing action at 10,000 kilotons and responsible for around 47% of all cumulative emissions reductions. So this really highlights this opportunity for Ames owning its own utility to be able to reduce a lot of the emissions through that utility and through actions there. And the net cost of this is $848 million. So here's an example that's a very big solar project, and there's a lot of these in California and Arizona, but there's also this one that's interesting in Ohio, in Licking County, which is around 180,000 people. It's a 350 megawatt solar project. Construction is due to begin in 2024. And this is projected to create 300 to 400 local jobs and 400 million. It's a $400 million capital investment. So we're around this level of renewable energy that we're projecting here. And so this is a similar size example as the action that we're showing. There's also been some updates here for funding. So in the Inflation Reduction Act, I think there's a lot in there, but the key thing for Ames is that municipal electric utilities were not eligible before for certain types of funding and now are being included for these funding opportunities, which makes it more attractive to own your own renewable energy generation, which could be an option down the line. The next big category is reducing vehicle emissions. We have that all light and medium duty vehicles sold in 2030 are zero emissions vehicles, heavy duty vehicles sold in 2030 and after are electric, and increasing the use of biodiesel between 2023 and 2030 and electrifying transit, resulting in 933 kilotons of reduction, 4% cumulative reduction of the total cumulative reductions. And this actually results in a saving of $957 million. And those savings are mainly due to two things. Number one is the reduced energy use of electric vehicles, which are about 3 to 4 times more efficient in their energy use than traditional internal combustion engines, and reduce maintenance costs for vehicles. So that's, and also the capital investment for electric vehicles is much less than some other actions, and we're getting closer and closer to parity between electric vehicle price tags and conventional vehicles. There's some new programs in the IRA that deal with certain aspects of this. One difficult part to address before was for heavy duty vehicles and commercial vehicles, and there's new funding opportunities for both of those now. And here's an example from Colorado, so Pueblo, Colorado, with a population of around 112,000. They're being very ambitious in their goal of electrifying vehicles in their city, and it's in support of the statewide goal of 940,000 EVs on the road by 2030. They're incentivizing EV purchases. They're partnering with dealerships to stock EVs and install charging stations on site. And they have targets for number of charging stations per 1,000 people. So they've already have projects of installing Tesla chargers, and they have more planned for the next few years. The next one is the increase in active transportation and transit use. So we have in the model that by 2050, 10% of trips in the city are completed using transit, replacing buses by electric buses, 40% of trips. So a lot of the short trips, 1 mile, 2 miles, 3 miles, completed by active means of transportation, so biking and walking, and car and bike share programs, which results in 660 kilotons of reduction. And this also shows net savings due to the less use of vehicles because of that increase of these other mode share, so active transportation and transit. In Grand Rapids, which has a population of around 200,000, they have a goal of 55% commute trips by transit, walking, biking, and ride-sharing by 2023. So they're very ambitious on that target. And they're also targeting policies to make sure that affordable housing is connected to that transportation network, and they're being very clear on their monitoring of progress and status. They have a website that shows different levels of funding and status of roads and things like that. And lastly, the last group of actions is the waste emissions. So we're in the model decreasing waste by a lot, 50% per household at the source by 2050, 50% of commercial waste diverted by 2030, 90% of organic or food waste diverted by 2028, and 90% of recyclables are recycled by 2028. And that leads to around 3% of our total emissions reductions. One city that's leading the way here is Santa Monica, California. They have a goal of 95% reduction from the city's 2004-2006 waste generation. They're doing that by increasing recycling and organics, and they're set to reach its first goal of reducing waste by 24% in 2024. And that is it for the examples. So we'll be taking questions now if you have questions.
Yeah, thank you everyone for that. Look forward to your questions.
Seeing no questions, we can move on to the staff report. Do an overview of that document.
Well, let's do a few more questions. So could you go back to the net zero construction? Because I'm really interested in this. And I'm really intrigued with the concept that this net zero construction offers such incredible savings. It's almost too good to be true. So if it's such a great opportunity why aren't contractors doing this on a voluntary basis? What's the need for incentives when there's such a carrot baked into the opportunity?
I think we're showing for Ames that there is still a cost to the net zero new construction. I think compared to retrofits, it is easier, and the premium for new construction, the investment is less. It's a good question why we're not seeing more of this. I think it's much easier to go with traditional design and to keep doing what's been done instead of pushing for these designs that would be passive house.
So it's the fact that contractors just aren't aware that these are out there, that if we just train the contractors, then they'll build the passive net zero construction houses. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, that's a good idea. The educating and training of contractors in Ames and net zero new construction.
And I think Yul has joined us now, and he had his hand up too. I think he wanted to throw in some information to answer that question.
Yeah, one other challenge on this one is the split incentive, where the person who's building the home isn't necessarily the one who gets the financial benefit. And so that's a barrier consistently to new construction. So if I'm a builder, I don't really have an incentive to make a really high performance building unless I can sell it more readily. But if I'm an owner, I get a lot of benefit because my house doesn't use a lot of energy and my energy costs will be very low. So that's a real challenge to overcome. And there are strategies as to how municipalities can help overcome that particular challenge.
We have a
One
lot.
other thing just to add one other quick thing. And then one other thing we often see is that often builders will build to what the regulation is. So one other way of sort of changing the outcome is, of course, to modify regulations where possible.
But if I'm gonna challenge the premise a little bit. I think if a contractor had the opportunity to sell a house that costs far less to heat, and the utility costs were negligible, wouldn't the price of the house, wouldn't that be a more valuable house? And therefore the contractor would benefit by being able to get a higher price?
I mean, think about it in terms of a rental. If the contractor builds it and then rents it every year, the renters have the energy savings when they pay utilities, not the builder. So what incentive does the builder have to do it?
Because the tenants would have
Out of the goodwill of their heart, they're going to build a
you-
more energy efficient building for the tenants to get a utility savings?
Would you rather rent a unit? And this is a good question because as you may be aware, we have a lot of rental units. And so we have to think through in terms of this. So Rachel raises a very good point. If I'm a tenant, I would rather rent a unit that has next to no energy costs. So I think this point again is there are economics that incentivize this efficiency if this is true. I had one other question, and that deals with retirees. We have a substantial number of retirees in our community who may not be so excited about learning that they're not going to have to ride their bike or walk. How should we think about that part of our demographic that will not be able to engage in the active transportation plan?
We'd have transit, for that, for sure. So improving transit too would be valuable. And I certainly see your point, and I'm not saying you're wrong, but it's also, there are retirees, I'm sure, who would prefer better bike and pedestrian infrastructure and would use it if it's good quality and if we have it.
I just want to be cognizant that we have to think about the particulars of who is in our community. We do have a lot of retirees that may not be as excited about that part. So
Other questions?
I'm ready to move on.
Other questions?
I've got a question, but I don't know whether you have an answer for it or not. how do we think about the different value in our vehicles between the heavy trucks that are using something like a B100 biodiesel and electrification of vehicles? Is there a scale where you've got the EV as at the high end, and at the low end you've got the typical diesel, and somewhere in the middle is the B100 vehicle? Or is the B100 vehicle really not going to get us very far and we have to look at electric?
That's a good question.
I think the way we modeled it and the way I think the right strategy here is if you have those vehicles that are able to use B100, use those and keep using those until the end of life, until we can then turn them over to electric vehicles. They are better than diesel vehicles. The emissions, they could be thought of as zero emissions because what they're emitting is captured in whatever is being used for that fuel, but they still pollute and they still cause air quality issues, but they're still better than traditional diesel. So that would be, I think our recommendation is to keep those until end of life and then make that switch when the opportunity arises.
The reason I ask is because I know that we have looked at the staff report and there are a number of feasibility questions on most of these 6 big moves. And so I'm trying to think about what's still going to put us forward, but maybe isn't going to get us as far forward as we would aspirationally like to be, but is still better than business as usual. And so that's why I ask, and it's not really a question, it's just an observation for maybe for council to be thinking about and to provide context for other questions I might ask.
Other questions? I have just one point of clarification, and that is, in your cost estimates, as you're, I'm sure, acutely aware, there's a life expectancy for batteries, solar panels, and other items that are being built into this. For example, just doing some research on Tesla's Powerwall for sake of discussion. They're saying their battery life is about 10, 12 years, essentially, and it goes down. Have you factored into your costs the fact that over a 28 or 30-year period of time, several of these items may need to be replaced, several times? And also, in addition, I think there's electric grid upgrades and other things that have to be done. Have those also been factored in? Because I think that we saw the $2.3 or $4 billion prior, and I think those questions were asked and it hasn't gone up. So I'm just curious how you factored in, one, life expectancy and replacement being in the cost, and then 2 is significant, grid improvements and power plant improvements or other things necessary in order to, accomplish this. Because obviously we're going to start requiring a lot more electricity to make this all work.
Yeah, those are great questions. So the model we use is a stock turnover model, and what that means, to answer the first part of your question, is that we have the stock of each physical thing. So if you take, let's say, a heat pump, and then let's say at the end of life of your natural gas furnace, you turn that over to a heat pump, that'll have a useful life to it, and then we'll retire that when that useful life is done in the model, and then buy another heat pump. So those costs are in there. And the way we calculate financials is to look at our business as usual scenario and see what the incremental cost of that heat pump is over what you would have had to replace anyway, and factor that in. So we do factor all those costs. For electricity transmission, we don't include that in our financials, and it is a very good point. One thing to keep in mind is that only in our business as planned scenario alone, with the massive amount of electric vehicles coming online and some amounts of solar, you would need to do those upgrades to your infrastructure. So even in a base case in the future that we're seeing, without going above and beyond and trying to tackle these actions, you would need those distribution upgrades. Maybe not to the same level though, so there is some margin there.
Or schedule.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. Deb?
All right. So turning our attention to the staff report, I do want to just reiterate that this is an analysis that was conducted by staff. So it is not the final climate action plan. It is not a formal implementation plan. It's information that has underwent a deep dive to give you a picture of the things that we need to be thinking about as we move forward with the planning and implementation stages. We've got our aspirational goal, and I think we've heard and we've seen where meeting that 83% by 2030 isn't possible. The modeling is looking at 70%. And so as we look at these action steps and talk about the things that will need to be done during implementation, it's what can we be doing to progress? I think that's the thing that's really important to think about, because a lot of this is a heavy lift. We have a lot of educating to be done to ourselves, a lot of educating to be done to the public and those in the community, because as stated earlier, this is a community plan. This is not a plan just for the City of Ames organization. This is community-wide. So we need the community to be at the table with us to move forward. So if you want to turn to page 2 in the document, that you'll see a table, and we have a clarification point on this particular table. The grand total at the very bottom for the net cost and then the total amount of emissions reduction, we're not going to use those numbers. So pretend that they don't exist there, because in talking with SSG and getting clarification, we can't do a grand total, because what we have at the first section of the plan or of the table is year 2030. Those are the net costs and the total amount of emissions reduction for that particular segment to get to that 83%, 70%. So there's a city component to this. There's a community component to this. And the city component involves those physical kinds of things that the city owns. So like our buildings, like our EVs, those kinds of things. It doesn't factor in the cost of additional staff or incentive or rebate programs. That would be in addition to what you see here. The community portion of that is then what is the responsibility of business, industry, homeowners, the rest of the community. So again, year 2030, we just look at what that total is there. That is separate in and of itself. And then you move down to year 2040, you see the numbers decrease for both the city and for the community. And that is because by the time we reach 2050, we will be realizing those savings over the longer term. That's when those energy costs and those kinds of things start to play out after we have done the heavy lift or the investment heavy part of the steps, starting with year 2030. Does that make sense? So ignore the grand total at the bottom. These are two separate, if you will, parts of the target. Okay. I'm going to move forward in the document to the staff comments, which start on page 20. And so I'll review those, and then we'll open up for questions for whatever section of the report you wish to ask questions about. And then we have staff available for those technical kinds of information. So as clearly noted this evening, this is a community climate action plan. And so we want to make sure that everyone involved understands a role or responsibility that they have with it. The city is not expected to fund each and every action step, but to provide support. And support can also come in the form of education and guidance. incentives, we know that to get businesses and people on board to carry out their role and responsibility, we'll probably have to have incentives and rebates available, and especially for our low and moderate income individuals. And so that's one of the things that council will need to decide at some point in time, not necessarily tonight, but what kind of incentive do you want to provide for these different programs, whether it's the retrofits, whether it's purchasing an EV, assisting with utility bills, whatever that may be. But that is something that we'll need to have you provide direction on. Skipping down to rooftop solar on private property. That was an action step mentioned in the big moves. And there are certainly fixed costs of serving customers that would need to be paid for the transmission, the transformers, the distribution, and labor. So rates would need to be adjusted to help account for those costs. So therefore, the remaining customer base would be subsidizing those property owners who would install the rooftop solar systems. So we would have to look at what kind of incentive would be provided to help with any type of rooftop solar. We want to be careful about not requiring this because doing so would then place the liability in the city for any type of rooftop solar that would be installed. So this really would be a voluntary participation type of program. New construction, we have.
Can I just clarify? I think Don can help us here. I think we're trying to point out that we have a system right now, rooftop, where we pay an incentive, a grant up front, $300 per kilowatt, I think. And also then we have we reimburse for the production of the energy. Remember that at the point 0.075, I think, in cents. We've said from the very beginning, we certainly support this approach of incentivizing the rooftops. But at that 0.075, we're really not recouping the cost of our distribution lines, right? Transformers, those type of things. Personnel, actually, to maintain it. So we're trying to say, if we want to move into that, we're suggesting we move to maybe eliminating the energy reimbursement, give more upfront in terms of a grant. That will reduce the upfront cost. It will actually allow a quicker payback to the customer, who will begin to perhaps realize those savings quicker. So it's a different approach, I think, we're recommending in that. But I think we suggested $1,200 per kilowatt. That's yet to be tested. I mean, what you have to understand, 90% of the success of this program deals with the community effort. And that is volunteer, right? Voluntary, I think, is what council's looking for. And I think SSG had results of their survey, if you recall, unscientific survey. But the majority of people either wanted partial incentives from the city or some wanted total. And we're going to have to find out where that sweet spot is if we're going to get people to participate. I mean, look at that retrofitting at $60,000. Even if you get $14,000 from the federal government, it's a substantial amount for ask our citizens to pay. So how much are we going to pay for it? If we're going to pay for 75% of the remaining part, 100%, those are the numbers we're going to have to talk about. And then we're going to have to talk about how you fund it, right? And we have limited funding with the state of Iowa. We're going to have to do it probably through utilities, and we try the utility rates. We're not going to, we can't increase water fees to generate money for some of the improvements in the electric utility. And then you had your general levy, right? Your property taxes. So it's going to be, we're going to have to think about these things as you move ahead. And we certainly support the rooftop, but we want to make a switch in philosophy, see if we can get more participation. And the interesting thing about rooftop, talk about dual, different benefactors. If we have to give this incentive, perhaps we have to raise rates for the electric utility to borrow money to get a pool of $1 million, $2 million, $3 million. I think I'm correct with the consultants that the payback they're talking about, the net out, really is realized by the property owner, the renter, or the property, which is good. But as they reduce their consumption, we're still left on the utility side to pay off the debt service. So you got to know that it doesn't pay off our debt. And then the vicious cycle is then we're going to have to increase our rates as the customer, the usage goes down. We're going to have to increase our rates to help pay for that debt. And this can all be done. I just want everybody to understand we're going to have to work out how we finance all this. But I wanted to talk about the rooftop and understand we're switching from another philosophy, right, Don? Isn't that about it? What we're asking for? We're suggesting.
I can't say it any more clearly than you did, Steve.
Oh, well, thank you, Don.
So can I just ask you a question then, Steve? We in the past have tried to increase rates slowly or plan for rate increases. Does this indicate that, given we don't know how many customers may opt for the rooftop solar and therefore reduce their consumption, that we don't have a means of anticipating how much a rate will have to be increased?
Right. That's what we're suggesting later on. I think a lot of the cities are doing pilot programs, because I think we want to start with just learn about it. How much it's going to take, how much interest is out there. We'll get a better feeling. We'll deal, and you'll see we're suggesting that probably the smallest and oldest homes, which will probably benefit the most, and probably because they're the most inexpensive, are probably people in the low and moderate income, more likely in that. So we'll be hitting both of your goals of sustainability and inclusion. But we've got to learn from it, because we don't know the magnitude of interest. And if you keep piling those, you'll see those different steps. If you go home electric, we talked about a 33%, another 33%, a 28%. I mean, you got to be careful here about the total cost to all customers, not even the low moderate income, just the medium income people. But we can do all this. I think we need more information to see, and it's going to be voluntary, I assume. We're going to see how many people are going to be interested in that. And I don't know if you need to go after every home. All those homes that could be built 2 years ago, and maybe they're already tightened up. We want to work on the oldest homes first, I think. Get your biggest bang for your buck. So to answer your question, we don't know how much, and we've got to develop a program that is going to be acceptable to people. There's a lot we don't know, I understand. And that's why we want to do it in a manageable. We don't want to sit around and wait. We want to go ahead, but maybe with a pilot program to start off with right away.
So to Gloria's point, what's been a typical, if any, rate increase in our electric rate?
We've tried to be competitive. It was always trying to be competitive. We've held our rates steady for many years. We didn't have a rate increase at one time for 21 straight years. We've had some 4% and 5% increases.
And so to Gloria's point,
to your point, excuse me, when I talk about those increases just for sustainability, we're going to have other increases just to maintain the system we have. If we had no effort towards sustainability, we would have to have rate increases, because we have to upgrade all of our transmission lines, our transformers, all those kind of, excuse me.
well, just the point is that staff report talks about, anywhere from 28 to 33 to, the point is we're talking about significant rate increases that our customers have not been expecting. If you have 2 or 3 layered on top of each other and you're at 100% rate increase and going from 10 or 11 cents to 20 or 22 cents, that's going to have a huge impact on everyone in our business community in particular is going to
Right. That's what the consultant gives us some information. If you look at that major chart where the cost per dollar and what you get in reduction. I think that the generation, and this is part of the city responsibility, coming up with that installed solar or wind, you'll see the cost is low per dollar amount of reduction. It's something we need to do. And we went through those, Deb didn't go over the different criteria we looked at as far as the administrative hassle, the cost, how we fund it, and things like that. That probably gives you your best bang for your buck on reducing our carbon. So that's why we're talking about that. But there'll be an increase too. I think Don told me a rule of thumb was I remember this because it makes me nervous. Every $500,000 you increase in expenditures, it could result in at least 1% in a rate increase. So that gives you a magnitude. Now, in 20 years, we might have more customers, so that may change, you know what I mean, to spread it. But so we've really got to prioritize where you want to put your money. And there are going to be rate increases, just like there'll be property tax increases. But like you've done in the past, I think you want to try to mitigate as much as possible. So that's why we have some, it may be different what the consultant wants, but we had some ideas on kind of a categories or some of the action steps we call it that fit almost in every one of those big moves that we could get started on right away. It seems to be cost effective. And then we'll have to see how much those cost too, right? We'll have to look at that a little bit closer.
So if you just do the math, we're talking about 200 megawatts solar. Is that right?
320,
320.
either wind or solar.
So by way of example, they showed a 350 megawatt solar farm,
Right.
400 million.
Right.
So that would be
Well,
2% increase.
Here's what, if we do this right, we'll do like we did the solar, community solar farm we have now. Don will go out with an RFP to see what interest is there throughout the country. You have to be willing to accept this fact that from private investors, because I still believe they get a better incentive for building it. They make the investment, just like they did in the one we have out here, our 2 megawatt. We will pay that. We will pay for that through a
Power purchase
power
agreement.
purchase agreement, like we do now over a number of time, which will recoup their costs plus, their return on investment. That's how we'll do it. So it'll be the private sector that invests in it. Now we have to make sure we scour the countryside to see if there's investors out there who want to do it. They'll finance it, and then we have to bring back a cost, and then we'll have to know what that will impact our rates, no doubt about it.
I'm just trying to get an idea of magnitude based on for every $500,000, it's a 1% increase in rate. Is that what you said?
Yes, that's correct. So you're looking at more like a capital cost expenditure. The way we would handle wind and solar, as Steve mentioned, we'd sign a power purchase agreement. It really comes down to then is what is on a power purchase agreement, all of the costs are energy only costs. So if we want to build 100 megawatts right now, you may be able to get that at 3 cents a kilowatt, which is just slightly above the price structure that we're paying under MISO. If you want to build a 10 megawatt one, the costs are falling into that 5, 6, 7 cents. So suddenly you see that small amount of energy, but they don't want to come in and just put in a 10 megawatt farm. So it virtually doubles. If we want to put solar panels on roofs, that could be 10, 14 cents a kilowatt or kilowatt hour, excuse me. And so it's just how much, how quickly, and how big we want to go. And if we can find a sweet spot in all those, because I don't want to double negative. I don't want to not have a retail solar program. I want to be able to allow any homeowner that wants to put solar on the roof, go ahead. I want to make sure that we're not overly subsidizing it, but I want to make sure that we're not borrowing from Peter to pay Paul kind of thing, and make sure that that's all happening. So it's the $500 would be like, let's say we wanted to add $1 million into our demand side management program to pay incentives into electric vehicle charging or whatever. That $1 million would cost us 2% a year in a rate increase to do that. So it's kind of done that way. It's not the same when we sign a power purchase agreement, because we have to compare that to what we're offsetting from a power supply standpoint.
So I really appreciate what you shared. And I wanted to, before we go further, I wanted to tell the staff, I think the staff report is extremely valuable. And people who are watching haven't had a chance to review this. This is an outstanding body of work. I don't know how much time went into this, but obviously a tremendous effort. I would like to make an attempt to flip the way we're having this conversation. Okay, so I'm going to think outside the box, seatbelts on. So we've been approaching this for a year from the perspective of we have this goal and we didn't know what it was going to cost, but now we do. And we still are proceeding forward as if we're going to do this. I totally embrace that we should do something from all 6 big ideas. I think everyone should be on board with that. But I think at this point, isn't it time that we start looking at the question of what is fiscally possible?
Well, let's do this. Let's put a pin in that one right now.
Okay.
Let's go through and have the staff report, finish the staff report. I think there are some suggested ways of going forward, and then I think your conversation would be appropriate at that time.
Okay.
All right, if you
Fair-
wouldn't mind.
fair
All
enough.
right. Okay, thanks, Tom.
All right, we're going to move on to new construction, and there had already been some questions about that. We know that at the state level, there are things with the building codes that really prohibit us from doing anything above and beyond to move ahead with green initiatives. However, what we could do is work with developers at the time of an annexation or through a contract rezoning, a commitment to net zero readiness. And what net zero readiness means is you're constructing that building, designing that building to become net zero at some point in time. So let's take the Aquatic Center, for example. One of the things we talk about doing with that building is making sure that the roof is built in a way that rooftop solar could be added at some point in time. Maybe not right away, but at some point in time. Or the building is situated on a property that's going to bring in enough sunlight. So windows will be a possibility to look at net zero ready. So those are just some of the things that are discussed and thought about in trying to make a building that's net zero ready. And at some point, those components can be added. But if we want there to be new construction net zero energy right from the get-go, then we look at these rezoning commitments or specific standards that would have design features that we would want in new development. So those are some things that we have control over that could be moved forward on, more policy oriented that we could do through planning and housing.
I just have a quick question on this. Maybe SSG knows. This seemed like one of the only approaches we could take that was more stick than carrot, to actually put a policy into place or mandate some of these ideas for new construction. Are there any cities or local examples that have done this sort of thing where they hold up all types of construction except net zero readiness?
I don't know of any communities holding up the construction, but I do know of some that show like accelerated permits and permitting and things like that. So maybe not completely holding it up, but creating those incentives where you would do that.
So we've offered, if you notice in the report, a carrot. And the way to do is establish a tax abatement program. So it's voluntary. So this would people come forward with commercial projects, industrial projects, or maybe even single family homes where it's not required now. But if you want an incentive, we can give a tax abatement. So that might be what you're looking for rather than the stick, the carrot.
I thought it needed to be noted that retrofitting existing buildings doesn't add to the assessed value.
That's right. That's right. That's why it'll work for new construction. I think Kelly's here.
So it does add to the
It did-
value of new construction.
Well, because there's no value. It's not that you do it. It's not.
It's
because
just
you
that the
have it.
home is more valuable once it's done.
That's right. It's the home goes up, not what you put on it.
Okay.
But when you do the retrofit, just by adding solar, or whatever, according to our assessor, that will not add enough value to generate the increment you need to give the tax abatement.
I see.
Yeah. Right, Kelly? That's
So one of the things that I noted in the report about this particular big move was that we have a lack of expertise in the community. So it seems like whatever the city does, if we don't have people who build that way, we are not going to be able to increase the number of net zero ready homes in the pipeline. So I wondered whether this is one of those opportunities for the city to partner with DMAC's Hunziker Center, which has a construction program in Finnish carpentry, to develop a new partnership and program.
Yeah.
Hawkeye Community College has a program in sustainable carpentry and construction. And that seems like one of those opportunities for the city to not be spending a lot of money, but be using resources instead of developing a training program to work with a college that's already got a training program.
Right.
And maybe provide some sort of, I can't think of what the model is. Maybe it's Teach for America or something, where if you get money to take the classes to graduate, you then are committed to working in a particular community in that program for a certain number of years. Maybe the city of Ames develops a means of helping to fund people to go to these programs as long as they come back and work within the Ames development community for a certain number of years. Those are just things that I was thinking of that seem to get around the problem of no expertise. And I like the idea of incentives, but you can incent all you like, and if there's no expertise, it's not going to get us anywhere.
And I do recall in the survey from last spring, one of the questions was about building a passive house or a net zero home. And there were 2 responses from citizens who had started going down that path, but trying to find somebody to design it and cost it out was the roadblock. And I think, like technology changing, over time, we'll start to see these design changes come about as well. But to your point, Gloria, absolutely, it would have to start coming from those community college programs and getting people into the field to start providing this level of design and service. Good suggestions.
That's a good idea.
I just want to say that I think that there are a lot of builders that are building really high quality homes, and they're probably hitting on almost all of the requirements for the passive and even potentially for some net zero as well too. They may not have all the elements, but and it just makes sense from continuous ventilation to making a building, tight, in terms of, not having air infiltration. And that's been going on for decades. This isn't just something which is just all of a sudden, oh, let's just go ahead and do it. I remember when I first started practicing years and years ago, passive solar was a huge thing, and basically making a really tight building and trying to take advantage of sunlight coming in was being done, and energy efficient appliances and energy efficient heating and cooling systems. And so I think that a lot is being done. So I just think that I want to be careful we don't discredit our builders. I personally think that they're doing probably a very good job. Is everyone? Maybe not, but I think that maybe a little coaching might take you to the next level from that standpoint. So I think maybe it's just a little tweaking to get to that particular point in that standpoint. So, and I know you weren't saying that they weren't, Gloria. It's just more or less just make sure we're all.
No, I'm just going with what the staff report said about lack of expertise available in the communities.
Yeah, I think your idea makes a lot of sense. Really, if you have someone that can do some coaching or having a guide developed of some sort. And so in this one, I think that there's potential in new construction, retrofitting. That's a whole different, that's a much bigger challenge in my mind. But anyway, so go ahead.
Okay, we'll go on to, I feel like we're kind of jumping around here a little bit, but we're going to talk about the increasing solar and wind generation that's owned by the city. So this is something that's within our control, since we have our own electric utility. It is one of the least complicated and least labor intensive step to be able to add solar and or wind generation to our electric services portfolio. Finding the land to do the amount of generation that is suggested in the action step would be one of the more challenging things that would have to happen. But staff has that experience with negotiating those purchase power agreements. And we have an RFP out currently for wind and solar farms. And so that is something that is already underway, and we're kind of testing the waters, whether it is more of a pilot project or something larger scale. We'll see what those responses are, but continuing to go down this path, I really think between electrification and these renewable energy generation sources, that is the basis. That's the crux of moving a lot of this plan forward. That's what it's going to take to help these other action steps come into place.
Can we just have Don, we want to tell them about the capacity? Remember, as far as MISO and the capacity, just so everybody understands, the 320 adds, it doesn't help our capacity, or what it's rated at, you know what I mean? Just so
So the generation that we look at is looked at from two unique standpoints. One is the energy specifically. So how much energy does it produce? When does it produce it? How does it produce it? So solar, for example, will produce energy, in the morning when the sun comes up, it'll peak at noon and then kind of drop down, a traditional bell curve. Wind is, when the wind is blowing, you get energy. When the wind isn't blowing, you don't get energy. What MISO does, and what we as a utility within MISO, all utilities have to do this, you're required to maintain roughly 110% of your peak load. So Ames peak is 130 megawatts, 110% of that is 145-ish. So to have 145 megawatts of capacity available, they look at each type of generation. And if it's dispatchable, in other words, you can turn it on and turn it off, you can count that capacity. With solar, what they do is they say, okay, the overall grid, the overall system's peaking at 5 o'clock at night. How much of that solar is going to be there at 5 o'clock at night? So they discount. So if you put in 100 megawatts of solar, they say that's worth 25 megawatts. So you're not getting 100% of your benefit. With wind, they look at it, and the standard right now is about 16%. So for every 100 megawatts of installed wind, you get 16 megawatts of capacity. Now, the way to improve that then is you set a series of batteries next to it so that you can take that wind, take that solar, store it in the batteries, and then offload it or discharge the batteries during your evening peak. And MISO is looking at the requirements on that. So it must have a minimum of, I believe, 4 hours of capability. So you would charge it whenever, and then you would start discharging it at, say, 5 o'clock at night till 9 o'clock at night. That would give you the equivalent with wind or solar of any of the other types of generation that we have. Those batteries today, I don't believe, maybe Eric can confirm, I don't believe we included cost of the batteries, which in our report, it's roughly $1 million per megawatt per hour. So if I needed 20 megawatts, that's 20 times 1 million times 4. So I would need to spend $80 million to, in essence, have a battery system that would provide 20 megawatts of capacity.
Is that a case where you'd say then that would be where you take your $500,000 per 1% rate increase because we're actually buying the batteries, or is that going to be part of your solar agreement?
Again, you're right, Mayor. There are some developers that'll say, "Oh, I'll put a block of batteries with that." Now, they haven't priced that the same way. We haven't seen any numbers that I can quote you, but I'm sure they'd be willing to do that. You pay them enough money, they're willing to package it with anything else. Ideally, we would want to have the control when those batteries are charged and when they're discharged, as opposed to there may be the wind and solar people may have different motives on how they might wish to do it. But it would probably be in our best interest in that case to own something like that, which I know there is IRA money for things like that too. I don't know to what level and things like that.
So I'm only bringing this up to emphasize as we switch more and more to electric away from gas and other, and we want to continue to do renewables. I'm saying we do renewables. We still have this other issue about capacity if we want to belong to MISO and you want to belong to MISO. So we'll just have to deal with that as we go along too. And we'll think about that. We're thinking about all those things.
And to that, to Steve's point, everything that we're looking at, we're not looking at getting rid of or mothballing or decommissioning any of the generation that we have today. We need that to meet our MISO obligations. We need that for reliability. It's just that the operation of it is going to be severely changed to where we'll generate as much energy as we can, wind and solar. But when wind isn't there, when the sun isn't shining, and we need to serve our customers, we're going to have to turn that generation on or have batteries or do something different. But we're not a plant. Within any of our models, are we planning to dismantle any of the existing generation?
Correct.
Does the city utility get to count private rooftop solar towards its requirement for MISO?
No, it's in essence looked at as like a negative load. So if an average peak home is 10 kilowatts, well, no and yes, sort of. Okay, so let me explain. If your house is a 10 kilowatt load and you put 7 kilowatts of solar on there, I won't see if the 7 is happening at noon, I'll only see 3, and that adds to my requirement. But by 6 o'clock when we're peaking, how much is that 7 kilowatts putting out? Maybe it's putting out 2. And if you're still a 10 kilowatt load, I'll see the 8. So I'm still responsible for the 8. I can't count the 2, but I don't see it anyways. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it disappears, if you will.
Sure, I follow.
So in the staff report, it talks about the consultant's analysis says we're going to require 320 megawatts of renewable energy sources. Does that take into account this derating factor you're talking about, or is that actually a net?
So that is a nameplate installation, and what it's taking into account is, for example, a solar panel is about 18% effective. So a 100 megawatt solar farm can produce on average about 18 megawatts on average. Wind is about 38 to 40%. So to meet our 130 megawatt peak, and all, I should say it that way, to meet our energy requirements over the year, which peaks at 130 and sometimes it's at 60, I need to build 350 megawatts of generation plus the 200 megawatts of rooftop just to produce the majority of the energy that we're going to need. So I'm building 500 megawatts, or we're installing 500 megawatts of generation to meet, on average, 100 megawatts of load.
And that also takes into account the incredible increase in energy, electric demand because of all the EVs
Right. It's gonna switch.
and all the heat pumps and everything else. So that 500 megawatt will be adequate to meet all that excess demand?
We believe so at this point. So, and again, when you say demand, there are some unique things that we can do. We don't want to hit new peaks.
Right.
Mr. Shanker has told me never hit a new peak if I can help it. So we would do things with rates that would move that, like charging vehicles. We'll offer huge incentives to start charging your vehicle at 7 o'clock at night when we have plenty of capacity, plenty of capability, do things like that. So
Demand management or thanks.
Amen. All right. Sorry to interrupt. I just want to make sure that you understand that.
The peak number. So I assume we expect electricity demand to go up because we're asking for a lot more to be electrified and less use on all sorts of fuels, natural gas, diesel, things like that. But do the so I guess I'm wondering, but we're also trying to make buildings more energy efficient too at the same time.
That's right.
And it's not like this would ever happen, but if we went for a long time without a peak greater than the one we had, like, are we ever allowed to lower that need? You know what I
I
mean?
don't think you ratchet down, do you?
yeah, so we've a couple of thoughts on that. First off, our last peak was July 25th, 2012. So we have not hit a new peak. We came very close this year, within a couple of hundred kilowatts. But we have, hit 118 one year, maybe 125, and it's weather dependent. And it's council's been extremely supportive in demand side management programs, which has caused us to say, put in an Energy Star refrigerator, put in high efficiency air conditioners and things like that. So that's one piece of it. So we're continuing to try to hold that down. We do things like air conditioner control. This year we were using text messages asking for our customers to conserve when we were getting during those high peaks. The other piece of that, though, when you said that we're trying to keep our peak down, by changing out furnaces and air conditioners with heat pumps, to be honest, our energy, the electric consumption is going to grow, not the peak, but all of that heating, which was natural gas, will now become electric. And
But
there are-
heating isn't when you have your peak, right? It's the summer when
It's
you
the
have
summer.
your peak.
But it's interesting as you look at that, and we haven't completely factored it out. We could become a winter peaking utility in January 15th at 2 a.m.
Yeah,
It
and
takes a lot of energy
But-
to
but you-
heat a home.
Your question was, if we ratchet up, is there amount of time that if you don't have that peak, does it ever go down? I don't believe it does it?
Once you set a peak,
that's why they
you
call
pay
it that.
for transmission on that.
Why
MISO
it's
looks
able to
at
do
that.
it that 1 hour, although it's more than an hour. What is it, an average hour? What is it?
It's 1 average hour.
1 average hour.
Hmm.
Because that'll set, it sets it forever, then your new peak.
Yeah.
And then you have to have capacity above that, which costs money, right? That extra 10% or 6%, whatever it
Right.
is.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you.
All right, we've talked a lot about community participation. As Steve noted, approximately 91% of the net costs needed to meet the climate action goals are associated with the community entities. So homeowners, business, industry, our local and our state and federal businesses that are here, so across the community. So one of the things that we're going to be asking you to think about as we move towards implementation is the creation of a community climate action task force. And involved in that task force would be leaders from the primary community groups that would get together and reach agreements on how each entity would be working towards meeting these goals and being committed to meeting these goals. So it would be a different group than what we have with the Supplemental Input Committee. So just a step to be thinking about. And then we've also touched upon inclusion throughout the evening tonight and the importance of weighing and balancing the environmental sustainability goals that you have, as well as inclusion, and how we're going to make sure that the additional dollars it will take to bring to light these initiatives, how we're going to structure incentives and rebates that will benefit our most needed citizens. So those are things that will have to be weighed out with the implementation plan. So I'm going to go through quickly some of the priorities for an initial implementation plan. When we take a look at the estimated price tag, the fact that technology needs to catch up to a lot of the things that we want to do and need to do, as well as trying to work through legal obstacles that exist with moving our plan forward. So we want to make sure that whatever plan we are pulling together, that it relates back to the 3 kinds of steps that we talked about when we first put together our RFP for the climate action plan. And that's developing a plan that's relevant, achievable, and the most cost-effective in reducing the carbon reduction within our community. So as a result of our analysis and looking through the evaluation criteria, the steps that we want you to think about are increasing our wind and solar generation as part of our electric services portfolio. This is a step that reflects low cost per ton of carbon removed, achieves the greatest percentage of carbon reduction, and requires minimal administrative burden. So we have quite a bit of control over it. The second is a waste to energy improvement in reducing our waste emissions. You're well aware that we have a waste to energy study underway, and that's coming before you in a workshop in December 20th to be exact. So we'll be looking at what the recommendations are out of that study, and then how we can dovetail that under our climate action plan and our implementation plan. And you've already heard about a month ago, 2 months ago, on the organized garbage collection system and ways that we can look at that system with our community that would help bring more curbside recycling in addition to the organics at a curbside level. So how we can pull those two tenants into our reducing our waste emissions. New construction, again, looking at changing our zoning ordinance that would include specific design features of a building to support net zero ready and passive design. And then also looking at maybe implementing a new tax abatement program that would help incentivize the new construction and design, and requiring the net zero ready and passive design as part of annexation. So those are just some things that we could work through on the new construction side of things. As Steve mentioned, when we talk about the retrofits, that doesn't really add any additional value to our homes. We would see the benefit of reduced energy costs, but it doesn't add anything to the assessed value. And then looking at a pilot program for retrofitting and looking at those existing buildings. Of course, we've got our municipal buildings that we can take into consideration and would want to bring a consultant in to study what we would need to do and what those recommendations would look like. But on the homeowner front, initial action step would be to implement a pilot program that could incentivize retrofits in homes, focusing on those smaller, older homes within the Ames Electric Services territory. Electrifying our municipal fleet. This would be our vehicles other than Cyride. And so Cyride has been well on their way of introducing buses into the fleet that are battery electric buses, and the transit board has a plan of purchasing 17 buses by 2050. But then the rest of our fleet, and what do we do about the other vehicles? We know that heavy duty EVs are not quite available yet, and so that will take time and technology to catch up. But we could look at a green fleet type of plan that would incorporate those vehicles as well as the vehicles that we're already swapping out. We've got a lot of hybrid vehicles. EVs are a little harder to come by at this point in time, but putting a plan in place to purchase those over time that requires additional dollars within our vehicle replacement fund. But again, another step that we can consider in moving the goal forward. And then lastly, the creation of a mayor's climate action plan leadership task force to take a look at bringing the other sectors of the community in on how they will commit to action steps that would help meet our goal.
So just so you know, what we're talking about, it's a little bit different community group. We're talking about people. Remember, we represent about 90% of the land area as far as our electric, but there are other electric utilities in the community. So they have to be involved at the table. We have other governmental units, Iowa State University, DOT, the National LZs, they'll have to be involved at the table. We also have some of the big industries in town. They're a major contributor to carbon. We're going to have to get them there. So it's a different kind of a group, kind of the leaders of those segments are going to have to come together. We're not going to be able to dictate to them, so that we're going to have to decide, find out. I think we'll be pleasantly surprised. They're working on this too. I'm not sure how fast, but they're working on it, and piece those all together and see how that helps us meet our goal. And they may have some ideas how we can incentivize them too. I don't know. So that's going to be a very important thing, because we don't to accomplish this. We're a small player really in all of it, but we want to be a leader in it. Don't get me wrong, but we cannot do it by ourselves, as Deb has said many times.
I have a question on the electrify the fleet non-Cyride. Is Cyride able to do any of the biodiesel with B100 like some of our other larger city vehicles
Barb's
might
ready
be doing?
Barb's ready to answer that question.
You beat me to the question, Rachel.
Okay.
Well, that's an excellent question, Rachel. We have not gone into the B100 yet because, quite honestly, there isn't a turnkey system right now. With RAG has reached out, so it's something we probably will look at once we're fully staffed. Currently, just for your reference, biodiesel is about $8.50 a gallon, and so it is very costly when you figure out how much it costs compared to what we're paying for.
What are you paying? What's
right now? I just looked it up. So this is through September. It's averaging regular diesel, $4 a gallon. I think it's 402 or something like that.
And what's
So,
your fuel budget per year?
we budget about 390,000 gallons of fuel currently.
So you have $4 times 400,000 gallons,
Mhm.
$1.6 million
million, yeah.
more, just in biodiesel.
In regular diesel, not the B100. Like,
No, I'm saying if you had to pay $4 more for
oh yeah, right,
for
correct.
B100, and you're looking at 400,000 gallons, right?
hmm
That's essentially $1.6 million in addition to add to your budget just to go to B100.
That's correct.
Seems like it might be more effective than electric buses, though, at least in the short term,
Yeah.
cost wise.
Well, in manufacturing of electric buses, that's taken some time too, right? Is that
Correct. We're still waiting for our first 2 pilot battery electric buses. That was a low-no grant in an FY19 due to supply chain issues and a bunch of other things. So now we're hopeful that they'll be here. I'm saying early 2023 because it seems like every time I say it, it's a change. So, but we do have 8 currently. We've been fortunate to get some discretionary grants. The board was able to program 3. So in FY23, we'll have 3 coming. And then we just received a discretionary grant for 3 additional plus 2 articulated buses. So we have 8 coming sometime between, depending upon supply chain issues, in 24 probably.
I just think I don't disagree that it'd be easier versus doing all electric bus fleet. But when you have a budget which is $11-12 million a year, to add $1.6 million to that budget, it's got to come from somewhere.
well? But how long has biodiesel been that? It hasn't always been a factor twice as much, has it? Or
It is typically more. So I could figure that out for you. I don't have it. I mean, we have a spreadsheet where we keep
Yeah,
track
probably
of
better
the
to get
rate.
the data on that. Then
So-
as part of
I
the
just mean,
evaluation.
yeah, because fuel costs will change, and that the consultants mentioned that too with natural gas pricing and things like that. And I assume that is the case with with other types of fuel too. Is that what we see now is maybe not always what we will see for the prices of them. But I mean, it is now, yes, but
And I think the other thing to keep in mind too, as we talk about electrifying the buses, is what we need for a maintenance facility and in storage and all of those kinds of things. And now those are costs that aren't factored into the original costs that the consultant has provided. So there are those things.
yeah.
But maybe too, over time, the reduction in some of the maintenance costs with electric vehicles, just overall, that can be realized.
Mhm.
And I mean, I do want to mention there is a reduction in maintenance costs, which they have mentioned, but there is also operational costs that increase when you have battery electric buses because we can't charge the buses like we could fuel a bus, right? So if a bus is running low on fuel, we can bring it in and fuel it. That's not how a battery electric bus currently charges. So we're trying to charge at off-peak time so that we can help with electric things like that. So operationally, if you were to run an entire battery electric fleet, you would need additional buses to support. So there's some studies out there that say you need 3 buses for every one. There's some that say 2. It depends on your operations. It depends on how much you're running. I mean, we start at basically 6 o'clock in the morning and we end at 1 o'clock in the morning. And on Fridays and Saturdays, it's 3 a.m. So we run close to a 24-hour operation. So of course, all those buses aren't out at all times, but there are buses that are out pretty much the majority of the day. So fueling, we'll call it, would be a little bit more of a challenge. So we did work with the consultant and they did determine, I think I wrote it in the staff report, that 17, without having to make operational changes and to be able to fuel on those off-peak hours, things like that, that was best for Cyrite at this point.
And to that point too, when you talk about additional buses for your service, that would be the same case with police.
Yeah, Corey can explain that. Corey, you want to
Yeah.
explain that?
Yep.
You don't think about that. When you run 24 hours, we have to have a backup when they're
Yeah, so in our analysis for the numbers, we talked about assuming we could get heavy duty in that 8 to 10 year time frame. Right now, our technology is we're saying we need 3 dump trucks to replace 1. So that's why you're seeing the big investment, 'cause it's going to what we're seeing now is they'd run 4 to 6 hours, and you'd still need 4 to 6 hours to charge with fast chargers. And like you saw last night, they got to run 24 hours a day, so we can't have downtime. Police is the same thing. Even a fast charger, if it's 15 to 20 minutes, they can't wait that long to have a vehicle ready. It wouldn't be a 2-for-1, but you need probably some additional. You have to change your operations a little bit to be able to rotate through. So there's a lot of that bigger equipment, specialized equipment, where we'd have to look at that. Electric distribution would need more vehicles to have 24-hour, be able to go out 24 hours a day. So that's some of the things we'll have to think about as we go forward. When we get to that point, those are the big kind of upfront costs, not including the infrastructure too, that you'd have to put in place to charge those type of, like Barb's dealing with now.
Barb, did I see in here somewhere that the state is giving us some money toward the purchase of diesel buses, but not the BEBs?
Correct. So the state of Iowa, how they fund buses, heavy duty buses for transit systems in the state, is they only fund diesel buses right now. It's not to say that won't change, but right now there is no funding for battery electric buses. So if I go to buy a bus, a battery electric bus, they'll fund the diesel portion, but I have to come up with the rest of it, the other portion of it, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. So what I'm wondering, and this goes back to that question I asked earlier about where is the biodiesel on the scale of doing us some good toward our goals. If we have 17 buses that we envision purchasing that are going to be BEBs, does it help us to add in even 2 or 3 more of biodiesel buses rather than having the rest of the fleet just be standard diesel? It seems to me that every incremental step we can take is an improvement over not taking a step. So that's just something that I would like us to consider. It's not all or nothing. Maybe we have the opportunity to get some state funding for diesel and then make the conversions to biodiesel and improve the situation, even if we aren't where we'd like to be with the BEBs.
Yeah, I mean, this is outside of my realm, honestly. Our maintenance department could probably speak better to this than I can, and maybe Corey can too. But I mean, I think we're open to doing some test of a biodiesel. It's not turnkey in heavy duty buses right now. I mean, some of the snowplow stuff there were more opportunities. They're not running as much. So like I said, it's not something we're not open to looking at. It's just, the technology isn't there yet. And I'd want to step into it slowly, just like we're doing with battery electric. I mean, the intention is to not get all 17 at one time. We've just taken opportunities for discretionary grants because when they come there, you want to try. They come one time a year. So you try to do your best you can to get those resources.
Yeah, and I think that'd probably be the best, because obviously for B100 you have to have a heated tank. We have one, so if we did a small number, maybe closer routes, they could use our fueling. Our contract with REG, which makes them a sole provider, does say that their B100 price matches the diesel price, so we don't pay any more for our B100 currently. The previous contract we actually even paid less. So Barb would be paying just diesel price kind of during this pilot. Obviously, as she scales up, then you're talking a lot of infrastructure. Same thing with electric. You're looking at a large heated tank, paying for heating, things like that. So there's opportunities, but like she said, it'd be a small step before you kind of make a leap.
All right. Thank you. Finish up.
I think I've wrapped up, but I wondered, Mayor, if Anita is online. So I don't know if she has any questions or comments.
Thank you. Anita?
Well, I had one question. In these recommendations, I know from time to time, we've heard from the community about the need for having a staff member that this is their entire job to look at, to write grant applications, to ensure that we are making climate action progress. Is that something that staff considered, or weren't ready to consider at this point?
Yep, so we're in the budgeting process for fiscal year 24, and that is a position that we are adding into the budget. We're calling it a sustainability coordinator. It will be a full-time position. So we do recognize the need to have a dedicated position to climate action and moving forward the goals and the action steps, and being able to be communicating with the community, looking at grant opportunities, and just in its totality. So yes, that is something that we are budgeting for fiscal year 24.
Thank you.
All right. Steve, you want to offer next comments or
I
next?
just want to mention something about finance again, because we've done a lot of work on this, and I hope the council doesn't come away with our comments or the community thinking we're against the program. I think you've charged us, we have to deal with the reality implementing. So we've thought about all these things, and financing is important. So we did talk about, we're appropriately charging the electric fund. We'll probably, if you need an immense amount of cash to get something going, depending on the amount of incentives you want, we'll probably have to borrow money. We'll have to use revenue bonds, and that's why we'll have to take the cost of that. We also checked as possible, we're with our bond council, we need a large sum of money to get going on GEO bonds. And I don't think we have a definitive answer, but I think they're leaning towards, it may be possible to issue bonds, but they won't be essential corporate purpose bonds, which means we need a vote, just like you would have to vote on a new fire station, new swimming pool. We'll have to get that clarified for you if we choose to do, the route in that area. It depends how much of the community you want to support with incentives. That's where the cost will be. But I don't think tonight we appreciate everything the consultant's done. We're trying to add some reality to it. Again, we're trying to balance probably what you want in terms of inclusion with the sustainability values. And we're not asking you to take any action tonight. Obviously, you're going to try to absorb what your consultant has given you, what we've given you, and we'll come back in the future. And we're looking for some direction, because we're going to be working with the consultant on implementation plan. We have tried to lay out some, I think, action steps that we think we should hone in on. And I think they follow most of the big moves, and we'll have to do a better job of quantifying that and see what it would look like. Whatever we come up with, I want to keep saying it's probably just the initial implementation plan, because I don't want people to think whatever we come up with, I say a pilot project, that's all we're ever going to do on rooftop. There may be another phase to it as we keep developing. We're confident technology is going to improve over the years. I think it's going to be a lot easier in fleet. You're going to see it's going to happen. And I believe there's going to be a market out there, and we'll see people developing businesses in this area as far as installation. It's just that we're a little ahead of the game. And that gets us a little nervous about accomplishing all this by 2030. We don't see the infrastructure in a place to help us yet, but I think it's going to be there. So we're going to come back. We hope we have like this initial implementation step that we'll be able to, steps that we'll be able to expand on as the world changes and gets better. So again, we're not asking for anything right now. You may have other questions, and we'll come back for another workshop perhaps to give us a little more direction.
Yeah, because so my question was, timing of how we move forward. So that implementation plan, how long we think.
I think
that
the mayor is
might
suggesting that we get back, not at a council meeting, but a workshop.
Sure.
So that means
February.
we have one in December, that's January or February, maybe.
Budget time.
We haven't talked to consult. We want to work with them too. We're we'll probably give you better ideas on our areas. You'll give us other thoughts, but I don't know. What do you think is realistic?
And during budgeting, we might see some of
Well,
this
Steve has talked-
anyway, right?
Steve has talked about putting some money already aside to kind of allow us to kind of have some.
There's
seed
three things I
capital.
want to try to do is give you a bigger chunk. You have $175,000 for sustainability now. I want to increase that substantially, probably out of savings for this year. Corey is going to put together a pot of money for purchasing EV vehicles. They're not budgeted. The extra costs not budgeted, but we're going to take some money and help departments when vehicles are up for renewal, where we have them. We'll be able to get EV vehicles. And then we also want to, I'm going to commit that I'm going to put in the budget the sustainability coordinator to be this focus point with all the responsibilities that Deb mentioned. to help coordinate with our departments. So those three things I'm trying to get in this budget. I think Tim pointed out the bulk of the budgeting for the sustainability plan will probably be in the year after, but I don't want to lose a year. So we'll be able to move ahead with a lot of these things.
Good.
And of course, we're moving ahead with a lot of things with Don's RFP and with our waste energy study. I just don't want you to think we're waiting on this.
No, and I appreciate that because I think, yeah, a lot of folks are anxious for us
Yep.
to get going. Though I understand the budgeting timeline too. But what did that remind me of? One other thing that we had mentioned, not the electric RFP. Oh, the recommendation about a different incentive method for rooftop residential solar. When might we expect to see that recommendation come through?
Well, that's if you want that to be an action step, we'd have to put together as related to a pilot program. If you buy off.
Well,
on that.
yeah, it sounded like that was something you were
Yep.
that staff would recommend as a way we could consider better incentivizing rooftop solar. So I was just wondering if that's on the docket to be presented to us, or if we have to ask for that. Like, that sounded good. We'd like it, please.
So right now we're working with URAB. We just met with them to look at a lot of our rebate programs, like maybe less incentives on air conditioners and more on heat pumps. And that will be coming to you the first of the year so that we can start rolling those out. We haven't specifically sat down and said, let's move from $300 to $1,200. We want to tweak that number and make sure that that's a number that would incentivize people to put more solar.
It might not
in.
be enough.
But
Right. I guess
we're definitely studying that area, and we will be wanting to present some change here in the near future.
Okay.
And by the way, there's a companion issue. You'll remember that you've challenged Kelly to come forward. Remember
I
about
do remember
changing our
zoning. Yep.
Kelly, I don't know, when are we bringing that forward about loosening up those requirements, the zoning requirements?
Next week. Wow, what
What do
good
you know about
turnaround.
that?
What good turnaround. That's
And very soon we'll be bringing a rate design to encourage off-peak charging for electric vehicles for large commercial and industrial usages. So
Good.
Lowers the rate quite a bit and makes it benefits the utility and also benefits the customers.
Mayor, are we taking any public questions on tonight?
No, the desire or the intent was tonight was just to get this big info dump
Sure.
on council and the public. But without a doubt, I think council's going to need to get a lot of public input on this. But I just have to say, until more specificity on cost and impact on electric rates, tax rates, and this kind of stuff, I think we're going to have not much public feedback in terms of people saying, well, wait a minute, let's stop. And we have to have both sides. We have to have people who are in favor of it, but also we have, for example, we have some very electric rate sensitive businesses that here in town. If all of a sudden we say we're going to have to go ahead and go up 30%, 40%, how would you respond if someone says, well, thank you very much, but we're moving our business out of town? So, I mean, there are a lot of factors here, and I fully support and look forward to, interacting with community leaders on this, climate action leadership task force. Because I've talked to some business people, they said, well, tell me what it's going to cost. What's going to be the impact? So far, we have a lot of general numbers, but we have to have some real specificity or some general ranges what we're talking about so that they can start getting their minds and accountants essentially, wrapped around it. I agree with Steve. There are many businesses that are taking some, action, but if we're going to ask them to go ahead and go the full share of what we're trying to accomplish, they may say, well, that's very nice, but we're not interested at all. And so we got to take that temperature. And honestly, in seeing Iowa State's climate action plan, it's not as aggressive as what we're talking about here as well, too.
Mm.
So I'm just saying is that,
Doesn't
so
come
that's
as
the
a
question.
surprise.
When can we start seeing some?
Well, first of all, I'll show you that when you tell me what action steps you want to focus on. I don't want to
Cost
quantify
out
20,
a bunch of stuff
29
we're
of
not
them
gonna ask
and
for.
No,
layer on it.
right.
And secondly, if we can have a rooftop system where we get a private company that's going to lend the money and we're out of it,
Why not?
that's great. So but if you tell me, and I don't know what the right answer is, what level of subsidy we're going to have for each one of the action steps you pick, then we can quantify the cost. because I know how much we have to raise from the electric fund or property taxes. So we need to start narrowing it down, the action steps you want, and think about the level of support you're willing to give or you think you need. And I don't have the answer for that. We don't know I can't tell you we need to do 75%, 95%, 100%.
Well, and there's probably research to be done on other funding sources too. Like we know some of them, obviously, right? But
I couldn't guarantee that, but
Full
certainly we
ones.
know, there are going to be outside sources.
so
I
there'll
don't
be
know.
other information probably to gather on that too.
Yeah, I mean, we could tell you there's grant possibilities, but I wouldn't
Right.
want to tell people I'm going to get a $50 million grant, so your rates aren't going to go up.
Oh,
But
no.
certainly we have to optimize the money that's out there.
Yeah.
I think you got to decide on the action steps, and hopefully they're not 29 of them. Maybe we can pick. We're
You-
trying to limit it ourselves.
And you put it down to 7 here tonight.
Did I?
Well, 7 here
Yes.
in the report. So.
That's what I.
Yeah, I like those.
All right,
I
so
think
so
those are
before we
great.
make any kind of direction, I'm gonna pull the pin out. Tim, you you made some comments. I just want to make sure we're
Yeah, I mean, I think Gloria, I want to come back to a point Gloria made. I think the issue of working with contractors makes a lot of sense. There's no cost to this in terms of trying to cultivate relationships with contractors to talk about building practices. Why not move on that right now? So I don't know if, can I just make a motion that we would
well. I think that
ask staff to develop a workshop or something, that we bring in a contractor that is familiar with this and start that process of educating our building trades in Ames?
well, what if that could be added to number 7 in the climate action plan leadership task force, where I could engage with
Sure.
contractors, versus trying to have a separate item.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
I think we're still in the information gathering stage and or evaluating some things, but I just want to make sure that you had the opportunity to share your thoughts before we go ahead and get a motion and draw our meeting to close.
Don't we want to
But
get
okay,
community?
anything else you want to add?
Yeah, so, I mean, that was one thing I want to say. And then the looking at the different cities, I appreciate the consultant helping us look at some different cities that were doing these different things. But the challenge I have still is that the overall price tag still has a lot of sticker shock. And if you look at this on a per capita basis, it's an enormous amount to shoulder on a per capita basis. And if you take out the students, it's double that. And so I'm concerned about that. So when the consultants first approached us about different ways of prioritizing, they gave us an option of looking at more of an evidence-based approach.
Yes.
And my sense is that we're now moving back to that.
Yeah.
I think there's a realization that we can't do it all. And so why don't we instead look at the capacity that we have and come up with a stretch goal, and then prioritize which of those kinds of improvements is going to have the greatest impact on our climate action goal. So let's do things that are the highest priority.
It's there.
That's what staff is. I think that's what
Yeah,
they've
it's-
done
But
here.
that's not what we've asked them to do up until tonight. So I think this is a turning point, in my opinion, as a meeting. Because I am concerned, as the mayor indicated, we have a lot of people in the community that are on fixed incomes. And if there is a significant increase in property taxes or utility bills, that's going to impact a lot of people. And I want to be sensitive to the fact that we need to be watching. We talk about the importance of affordable housing. This is going to make housing less affordable if we increase the property taxes and the utilities. So these are all things that we have to balance and get public input on.
Rachel?
Yeah, so that was my comment. Are we being asked to approve or get a motion about this initial implementation plan at the end of
Nope,
the staff
Nope.
report?
We just offered our opinion.
Okay, because I think we kind of.
I'm not asking you to vote on this.
Input from the community
Right.
first on the whole process.
Right.
So I do think, though, that is not be helpful to say, is council supportive of these 7 points being further investigated, or even pause on that tonight?
I wasn't.
I'm just asking.
I didn't want to put you in the spot
Okay.
to do anything. I was.
Well, I think that to your point, then, Rachel, is that this is this is what's initially being talked
That's
about.
what I would.
And then,
It's evidence based. We're trying to come up with something,
Yeah.
but we haven't finalized the quantifying of to see if we can even afford
Right.
those 7, because it depends on the number of houses you want to do at 60,000 a piece or 40,000 a piece. I can quantify that, and then I'll tell you what your property taxes or your electric rates will have to go up. But we're gonna have to decide on that, the magnitude of it.
Well,
I mean,
Go ahead,
could
Rachel.
you explain maybe a little bit more how these 7 are kind of picked? Is it because of their emissions reduction potential? Is it
Yep.
because of the cost per person or
Yep,
other
not cost per
factors?
person, but I think if you have that, their,
the 8 criteria:
the criteria, there's a great,
cost, administrative effort, feasibility,
Yeah,
legal
yep,
feasibility,
yep,
funding
yep.
sources.
So were those
so the generation,
all
if you
ranked
remember,
then, or?
generation of the consultants, it was the largest, you get the most reduction,
Mhm.
but then it had a low dollar cost per reduction of
Right.
ton.
Mhm.
Okay, so we looked at that.
The administrative effort.
The rooftop is kind of, you'll ask Sarah, she shakes when she thinks about it. If they're gonna have to go out and talk to 18,000 different homeowners, convince them to do it, and then you've got to work through the actual construction and then verify it's done, and that's a lot of labor compared to just us buying into a wind farm or a solar farm. So we looked at those criteria and the dollar cost and the amount of reduction. And then we tried to get one from almost all the big moves too, right? We didn't want to disregard any of them.
So
So
it's kind of the best in all of the categories is
Kind
in
of.
the 7.
Yeah.
Okay.
they kind of fit with all. And you might not agree with those criteria. We are concerned about the administrative hassle in there and the confusion. Just more times the public has to deal with us and education. It's going to be harder. But we went through all those and how we fund it. In other places, maybe Canada or maybe New York City or whatever, they can do certain funding that we can't do. We're limited, as you know, local government's limited here, how we can raise funds. So we want to make sure if it's possible to do. And then does the feasibility, do electric dump trucks exist today? We probably can't do that right now. So we factored all those together, and it's probably an imperfect program, but I think it's something we feel good about taking the next step to get more information that you're asking for.
Anything else?
Well, so I mean, I agree that we want some time to digest and everything, but also I heard that maybe a workshop to review these 7 and discuss and vote on these
And get public
7
input.
items.
Get public input initially.
And
Go
that
ahead.
would maybe be for the first few months of the new year, perhaps,
Mhm.
ideally.
Mhm.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to kind of get a frame of
I
time.
think so.
I think the one thing that we need to be, I'm not sure at that meeting that you're going to vote on an implementation strategy because
No.
you still need to get a lot of public
Right.
input, but it's to be the next step.
Yeah.
If it wasn't, we got one workshop planned for in December already, which is an important one. Actually, it's a piece that fits into this puzzle.
Yes.
And then we all know January and February is budget time and everything else. So probably mid-February or sometime in March, depending on how the schedule.
But we are not standing still. We're moving ahead in different areas. I want you to understand that.
Yeah.
We're not going to put this on hold until you give us some direction, because we're going to move ahead with electric vehicles and other things
Good.
and taking RFPs.
Okay.
And I think these 7 items are really good steps. It's a good springboard to move ahead into the implementation part of the project. It's good that SSG was here tonight and was able to hear your comments and be able to help us fashion this into more of an implementation type plan and get that public input. We need to re-engage the supplemental input committee and then get the broader community input on these items and the implementation plan as a whole. So hopefully you saw benefit in this. And I just want to thank staff one more time. This is a very, very collaborative effort. And I truly appreciate all of their time in providing the information and researching the information. We have a lot of information that was provided to us that I think will be very helpful as we look at implementation steps.
One question, we can keep some of these numbers up on top of our head. Steve, do you happen to remember off the top of your head, no pressure,
I remember.
our bond capacity? So if we were to try to finance these, you happen to remember that?
Of course I do. You want to share it with you?
Yeah.
As of next year, No, it's 134 million.
We spent some of that.
Huh?
I asked the same question this afternoon.
Based on our this year CIP, not next year where we have it, there's about $134 million. But we have planned, now remember, that debt deals with general obligation debt, okay? Not if we issue revenue bonds. But we have a number of projects that I'm gonna have to get you, help us prioritize: fire stations, animal control shelters, maybe recreation facilities and other things we've got to deal with. That's what we have. But what was the net, Mayor? It was 90.
In the streets, other streets.
Oh yeah, and we issue $15 million in street bonds every year, general obligation bonds. So I don't know exactly, but you're trying to find out how much capacity we have.
Correct.
It's a different kind of thing, because I would not recommend that you use our debt capacity, our geo bond debt capacity for these projects. Okay, we're probably going to do electric mostly, and if we do the other geo bonds, it will be a referendum that people will vote on. So it won't be a special corporate purpose. So if you net it out, there might be $90 million left, let's say.
Okay. So,
but that'll change with our CIP, which we have other projects besides sustainability projects, is what I'm trying to
but this is what I'm trying to tease out. I mean, if there's one thing I'd like to offer tonight's discussion, is just like a family, that we have a certain amount of revenue and certain expenses, and we can allocate a portion of that for a desired expenditure. It's really the same thing as a city. We have a finite borrowing capacity. We have a finite taxing capacity. Would it make sense as a council for us, and this is where I want to talk about working backwards, why don't we as a council decide this is what we think we can afford in terms of our borrowing capacity? We're willing to take on this debt, and then we're willing to increase taxes and utilities, and then let's sort of agree upon this is what we have to spend, and then use that as a mechanism for then going through this list and finding out what's the highest priority. What if we were to do that?
Well, what we have to spend or what everybody has to spend? That's the tricky part. I mean, we can say what we've got to spend, and so that'll limit us to what we'll spend on incentives, what we'll spend to retrofit our own buildings and electrify our own fleet, right? So that's one chunk of money that we will spend. But there's all these other funding sources out there, and that's where what you're proposing becomes difficult, because we can't really, it would be very hard to name what all those other funding sources limits are.
So, and I appreciate that. This is a bit of a variable that's hard for me to wrap my brain around. President Biden in July offered an incentive package for climate efforts in the entire country. And the amount that President Biden issued in that proclamation, July 21st, was $2.3 billion. Ironically, the number that the city of Ames chooses was looking at. So I just want people to be cautious about presuming that there is going to be an unlimited amount of federal funding or state funding. I think we really have to approach this by and large that we're going to pay this on our own. And if we get some great federal dollars, I think that's icing on the cake. But from a planning perspective, do we want to prioritize based on what we hope we get, or should we prioritize based on what our capacity is? And then we can create some projects that if we get federal funding, then we can do those as well. I think we should prioritize based on what our capacity is.
I think to Brown's point, I think it's also mentioned in the implementation strategy. And one of the slides, it said it includes funding opportunities and program design. And so there may be other opportunities for public-private partnerships. There may be opportunities for federal funds, state funds. And that's where I think that's where I understand where we're coming from in terms of working, backwards from our capacity. Maybe there are some other opportunities, but then the point is that those opportunities evaporate or get used up. then we maybe can't go as far as we want to go also.
I mean, every other city in the country of our size is going to be competing for those
Yeah,
dollars.
yeah. Like,
So I
I
just-
understood.
Yeah, I want it to
Just
be
not
realistic.
optimistic.
There might be monies out there, but we're not going to get $20 million grants, the city of Ames alone. So we'll have to prioritize what we want to do.
Yeah.
So there'll be money out there, but I
And here's the other
don't
thing too
want you to
is,
think it's going to pay for everything.
This is my concern.
This can be competitive.
Right.
well, I was talking to an individual who was saying that their corporate company, it's an international company, is committed to sustainability, and they're actually providing funding for some solar. And it's not in this community; it's a different community. So that's where I think that this funding opportunity, we want to leave the door, I think, a little bit wider open, saying, here's where we want to go, here's our aspirations, here's our goals. We know what we can do, but I do think there's some opportunities for, what be it grants, federal, state, private nonprofits. Maybe you're going to, who knows? But the point is that maybe there's almost two categories, what we're going to be able to commit to.
Right.
And then here's what we'd like to see accomplished. Here are some opportunities to go after, and that's where the grant writer comes in. Maybe that's our contribution, is just staff time trying to pursue extra things.
Yep.
But then we have a broader perspective and a broader goal than just what we can do by ourselves. I mean, that's my thinking. And
I agree with that.
I think that the implementation strategy will help us tease that out. So, all right, in closing, Nita, you've been very quiet. You've been very, anything you want to add?
I don't have anything to add. I appreciate the conversation. I guess my only other thing to add would be just the reminder that choosing to do nothing also has a cost, and we know that, and that's why I believe that the council first started down this road. So glad to hear the discussion and looking forward to the next steps.
Thank you. All right.
One other thing that Steve, you on the sorry, turn the page already. On the retrofitting existing buildings, or we talked about this informally about the idea of wrapping up both climate goals as well as rehabbing houses. That really has sort of a dual purpose. Is that something that you're thinking about here as well, or is this
That's a
is
different
this separate?
cost. That's a different cost. Usually you rehab, you want to bring it up to code, and that's maybe a different list of chores or tasks to do. This would be on a very specific task on buttoning up.
Though sometimes they do go hand in
They
hand.
might go hand in hand, but I don't want you to think they always do.
No.
So I think you're thinking about something broader on rehabbing, aren't you?
Well, I just want to think
I
of
can't
the
guarantee you
question.
that's the way. That'll be that might be more than 60,000 a home if you want to.
But there are certain improvements that would do both, like knob and tube wiring upgrades, right? And
Windows.
electrical panel upgrades that would
There's
allow
some.
for, yeah.
I just wanna
Well,
keep that
maybe
in
you're
mind.
asking me when we develop that program, make sure they accomplish both.
Well, at least to be thinking about that.
Yeah.
Um,
When we put the program together, we'll have to see what qualifies for the retrofitting, right?
correct.
And
Yeah.
in that case, I thought we were leading towards carbon reduction, but those items that do both would be give a priority. But to think about it.
Okay. Deb,
Point.
thank you for your report. Thank you for, again, like your staff, everyone that put a lot of time and effort into it. While it's only 26 pages long, I'm sure it took a lot of
Right.
work.
It's a
So
dense
thank you.
26 pages,
The
right?
first iteration was much longer.
Well, thank you for condensing it. We greatly
Josh,
appreciate
36
that.
pages we had to
I will say it was a challenging 26 pages to go through. There's a lot of information in it, but thank you very much for your efforts. We greatly appreciate it. All right, moving on agenda, we have no dispositions of communication to council. So,
Well, Mayor, I was going to ask, oh, you want me to do that in our council comments? Okay.
all right. Now, council comments and Bronlin.
Well, we did get an email. It was sort of, it was a little later than our cutoff for dispositions, but I thought since it's a time sensitive issue, I'd like to move that we approve lighting the band shell for Transgender Awareness Week this year, and I would approve lighting it that way for future years.
Second.
When is it?
Okay.
When is the week?
It's the 13th through the 20th, so we would only catch the tail end of this week, but for future years too, to allow.
It's already done.
Oh, it's done. Oh, so we had to approve it. Perfect.
All right. Well, it's an easy motion to vote on, that, isn't it?
Yeah, all right. Good.
No, let's
Do we wo-
withdraw your motion then.
Well, can we vote on it anyway?
Sure.
All right.
And those in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed or abstaining? Motion carried. Anything else? Rachel?
Thank you to all of the city staff for all their time put into this. I know this is a lot of work and a lot of things that aren't definite yet to figure out. So I really appreciate that. And I'm looking forward to getting community input on kind of what staff thinks is the way forward, and seeing if that aligns with what the community has an appetite for.
I would also like to thank staff for the report. It was very interesting and enlightening in a lot of ways. And I want to reiterate what I said earlier, and that is that we should be thinking about the small things too, because every step forward is still a step forward. Whether we're hitting that target with each step is maybe beside the point. We need to move forward. And so even that little bit of progress in the right direction is still progress in the right direction.
Okay. Anita?
I just want to echo the thanks to the staff for their work in continuing to move us forward. So thanks.
All right. The only thing I have, council, is that we do have a need for a very, very short council meeting telephonically on Friday morning at 8:30.
During our conference?
We'll just do it by telephone. Yeah.
I'm
I checked
busy. I'm going to be at a conference.
I know. Well, I think
Available.
point is that it's it'll take about 1 minute, but it's something just came up all of a sudden. I mean, it's time sensitive. So anyway, just so you're aware, agenda will be coming out and all posted. But it has to do with a project which is a high priority, and that is the railroad helping pay for the improvements at the sidewalk on 24th Street.
Oh, hey.
And the just full disclosure, the price has gone up significantly. So we need some council consideration and action. And the action form will, council action form will be forthcoming here soon. So with that, entertain a motion to adjourn.
Move we adjourn.
All right. Those there say aye.
Aye.
All right. We are adjourned. Thank you.